A cartoon animal that appeared in a newspaper comic strip in 1936 gave its name to the most important military vehicle of World War I. Not inspired it, not influenced it, named it. The soldiers who drove those vehicles across the deserts of North Africa and the forests of Europe and the islands of the Pacific called them jeeps because of a small yellow animal with a long nose that ate orchids and could walk through walls and existed in a dimension that was not quite the one everyone else occupied. Eugene the Jeep was in Popeye's comic strip for less than 3 years before the war started. The vehicle that carries his name has been in continuous production for over 80 years and is one of the most recognizable automotive designs in human history. And almost nobody who has ever driven a Jeep knows where the name came from. Almost nobody who has ever watched Popeye knows what Eugene the Jeep actually was, or what he could actually do, or what the 14 buried facts about his creation and his legacy actually reveal about one of the strangest and most overlooked chapters in American popular culture. Until now, before we dive into video, please subscribe to our channel. Fact 1. Eugene the Jeep was introduced as a gift from Africa, and nobody questioned this for decades. Eugene the Jeep made his first appearance in the Thimble Theater comic strip on March 16, 1936, when Popeye's Uncle Ben returned from Africa carrying a small, strange animal as a present. The animal was described as a Jeep, a creature from a fourth-dimensional world that happened to overlap with the human world in specific and unpredictable ways. No explanation was given for why Uncle Ben had been in Africa. No explanation was given for why he had brought back this particular animal rather than any other. No explanation was given for what the fourth dimension was, or how a creature from it ended up in Africa where a sailor's uncle could catch it and bring it home as a gift. Elzie Chrysler Segar offered none of these explanations because he understood something about how readers engage with genuinely strange creative ideas that most writers take years to learn. The strangeness is the attraction. Explain it and you diminish it. Leave it unexplained and it expands in the reader's imagination until it is larger than any explanation could have made it. Eugene the Jeep arrived with no origin story and became one of the most memorable characters in Thimble Theater history precisely because the absence of an origin story gave every reader the space to develop their own theory about what he was and where he had come from. Fact 2. He could only say one word, and that word was his own name. Eugene the Jeep's entire vocal range consisted of a single sound, Jeep, delivered in varying tones and frequencies that Segar used to communicate the animal's emotional states and responses without ever clarifying exactly what those states and responses were. The creative limitation that Segar imposed on the character by restricting his speech to a single repeated syllable was not a concession to simplicity. It was a precision tool for generating reader investment. A character who speaks a language the reader can partially interpret, but never fully decode, requires the reader to participate in the interpretation, and that participation creates a sense of ownership over the character that fully legible dialogue cannot produce. When Eugene said Jeep, in response to Popeye's question about whether Bluto was dangerous, the reader had to decide what that Jeep meant, and the decision made the reader a collaborator in the scene rather than simply an audience member observing it. Segar used this technique consistently across all of Eugene's appearances, and the result was a character who communicated more effectively through one syllable than most comic strip characters communicated through paragraphs of dialogue. Fact 3. He could predict the future, and the strip treated this as completely ordinary. Eugene the Jeep possessed the ability to answer any question about the future or the present with complete accuracy. Popeye and the other characters in Thimble Theater asked Eugene questions about what was going to happen, and Eugene answered with his single syllable in ways that proved reliably correct. And the strip treated this extraordinary capability as simply one of the things that Eugene could do rather than as a miraculous power requiring explanation or exploitation. No character in the strip attempted to use Eugene's precognitive abilities for financial gain in any systematic way. No character questioned the implications of having reliable access to foreknowledge, the philosophical complications of knowing the future, the question of whether foreknowledge changes what is known or whether the future is fixed regardless of knowing it, were not addressed because Segar was not writing a philosophical text. He was writing a comic strip, and the comic strip needed Eugene's precognition to serve narrative purposes rather than to generate metaphysical debate. The ordinariness with which the characters accepted this extraordinary capability is itself a piece of sophisticated comic writing, because the comedy of any fantastic element in a realistic context depends entirely on how the characters surrounding it respond, and characters who find the miraculous unremarkable are funnier than characters who find it astonishing. Fact 4. He could teleport and frequently used this ability to disappear at inconvenient moments. In addition to his precognitive abilities, Eugene the Jeep could appear and disappear at will, traveling through the fourth dimension to move between locations, without traversing the space between them. This teleportation capability was presented in the strip through the simple visual device of Eugene being present in one panel and absent in the next, without any indication of departure. And it was used by Segar as both a narrative tool and a comedic one. As a narrative tool, it allowed Segar to place Eugene wherever the story needed him, without requiring a logical explanation for how he got there. As a comedic tool, it allowed Segar to have Eugene disappear at precisely the moments when his presence would have been most useful to the characters who needed him. A joke about the fundamental unreliability of help that resonates, because it describes an experience that every reader has had in their own life regardless of whether their helpers can teleport through the fourth dimension. Fact 5. His dietary requirements were completely specific and completely absurd. Eugene the Jeep ate orchids. Not occasionally and not as a supplement to a more conventional diet. Orchids were Eugene's sole nutritional requirement, and the strip maintained this detail with a consistency that required the characters around Eugene to regularly source orchids for him in contexts where orchid availability was not guaranteed. The specificity of this dietary requirement was a creative choice that served multiple functions simultaneously. It established Eugene as a creature from a genuinely different order of existence, whose needs were not compatible with the ordinary world he had been brought into. It created recurring narrative situations in which the character's concern for Eugene's well-being generated plot momentum. And it produced a recurring visual joke in which a small yellow animal with a long nose delicately consumed flowers, while the humans around him dealt with situations of varying severity. The contrast between Eugene's refined dietary preferences and the chaos typically surrounding him in thimble theater was a consistent source of comedy that Segar calibrated with a precision that suggests he thought more carefully about what Eugene ate than most writers think about their characters' motivations. Fact 6. The military tested his name before adopting it, and the test involved soldiers who had never heard of Popeye. The question of how Eugene the Jeep's name transferred to the military vehicle known as the Jeep is one of the most contested etymological debates in American automotive history, and the military's own internal documentation of the naming process is less definitive than the clarity of the outcome would suggest. What is documented is that the vehicle that would become the Jeep entered military testing in 1940 and 1941, under various designations, including the General Purpose Vehicle designation, which produces the acronym GP, and which some historians have proposed as the actual source of the name through a phonetic simplification of GP to Jeep. What is also documented is that American soldiers in 1940 were reading Popeye in their newspapers with enough regularity that the Jeep designation from the comic strip was available to them as a reference point when they encountered a vehicle that moved through difficult terrain with the same apparent disregard for obstacles that Eugene moved through walls. Whether the military Jeep was named by a soldier who read Popeye and made a spontaneous connection, or whether the GP acronym independently produced the same sound through phonetic coincidence, is a question that the historical record does not definitively answer. What the historical record does show is that by 1941 the name was universal, and by 1942 it was global, and by the end of the war it was one of the most recognized words in the English language, and Eugene the Jeep was its source in fact or in spirit or in both simultaneously. Fact 7. Segar died before he could explain what Eugene actually was and took the explanation with him. Elzie Chrysler Segar introduced Eugene the Jeep in March 1936 and died of leukemia in October 1938, leaving the character and the strip in the hands of successors who understood what Eugene did without fully understanding what Eugene was. Segar's notes and correspondence from the period of Eugene's creation do not contain a complete account of the character's nature or origins, and the interviews Segar gave in the 2 years between Eugene's introduction and his own death do not address the character in the depth that subsequent generations of Popeye scholars would have wished. What this means in practical terms is that Eugene the Jeep is a character whose creator died with his secrets intact, and whose subsequent appearances in the strip were produced by writers who were elaborating on a mystery they had not created and could not fully solve. The Eugene that appeared in thimble theater after 1938 was consistent with the Eugene that Segar had established, but it was consistent in the way that a good impression is consistent with its original, capturing the surface qualities while leaving the interior architecture that produced those surface qualities unexplained because only the person who had built the interior architecture knew exactly what it contained. Fact 8. he was based on a real animal that does not exist. The Jeep as a fictional creature was described by Segar as belonging to a species that existed in the fourth dimension, and that occasionally intersected with the human world through mechanisms that were never fully specified. This description places Eugene in a tradition of impossible animals that appears across multiple cultures and multiple centuries, creatures whose existence is asserted with complete confidence despite their biological impossibility and whose impossibility is precisely what makes them culturally durable. The unicorn is impossible. The phoenix is impossible. Eugene the Jeep is impossible. What makes Eugene distinct within this tradition is that he was created not by mythology or folklore, but by a single cartoonist working in a newspaper office in New York in 1936, and that his impossibility was designed from the beginning to serve specific narrative functions within a specific fictional world, rather than to embody universal symbolic meanings. Eugene is the only impossible animal in the Western tradition who was invented for a daily comic strip, and ended up naming one of the most important military vehicles in history. The category he occupies is a category of 1. Fact 9. He inspired a real scientific term that is still in use today. The word Jeep entered American English in two distinct ways simultaneously in the late 1930s and early 1940s. The first way was through the military vehicle. The second way was through the scientific and engineering communities that began using Jeep as a descriptor for any new or experimental piece of equipment that was being tested for the first time. This second usage drew on the same quality that made Eugene the Jeep an effective name for the military vehicle: the sense of something novel and undefined and operating outside the established categories. Engineers and scientists who needed a word for an experimental prototype in an early testing phase had access to Jeep as a descriptor that communicated exactly those qualities, and they used it. The scientific and engineering usage of Jeep as a term for an experimental prototype predates the vehicle's widespread adoption of the name, and may have been an independent parallel development from the same comic strip source, rather than a derivation from the military vehicle. The documentation that would definitively establish the sequence of these usages does not exist in a form that allows certainty, and the ambiguity is itself a testament to how quickly and how completely Eugene the Jeep's name escaped the fictional world it had been created in and entered the vocabulary of multiple real-world domains simultaneously. Fact 10. He appeared in the animated cartoons so rarely that most people who watched Popeye cartoons their entire childhood never saw him once. The Fleischer Studios animated Popeye cartoons, which ran from 1933 to 1942, and which are the versions of Popeye that most people who did not read the original newspaper strip encountered, featured Eugene the Jeep in only a small number of episodes despite his significant presence in the newspaper strip during the same period. The decision to limit Eugene's animated appearances reflected the production philosophy of the Fleischer operation, which prioritized the formula of Popeye versus Bluto over the more narratively complex storylines that Eugene's capabilities required. A character who could teleport and predict the future and eat orchids and exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously was not easily accommodated within the 7-minute short format that the Fleischer cartoons used, and the writers who adapted the strip for animation consistently chose to set Eugene aside rather than to develop the more elaborate narrative structures his inclusion would have demanded. The result was a generation of Popeye viewers who knew Wimpy and Bluto and Olive Oyl and Sweepia, and had no idea that a yellow animal with magical abilities was one of the most significant characters in the source material they were watching adaptations of. Fact 11. He was more powerful than Popeye, and the strip acknowledged this directly. Popeye's power in thimble theater was contingent on spinach. Without the spinach, he was a strong and capable sailor, but within human limits. With the spinach, he was extraordinary, but the extraordinary was finite and situational. Eugene the Jeep's capabilities had no equivalent contingency. He did not need a vegetable to access his powers. He did not have a power level that could be depleted or a vulnerability that could be exploited. He could not be contained because he could teleport. He could not be deceived because he could predict the future. He could not be harmed in ways that mattered because he existed partially in a dimension where the physical laws of the human world did not fully apply. By any objective measure of capability within the fictional world of thimble theater, Eugene the Jeep was the most powerful entity in the strip. And Segar acknowledged this directly in several storylines, where Eugene's assistance was the decisive factor in outcomes that Popeye's spinach-enhanced strength could not have produced alone. The strip's nominal hero was regularly dependent on a small yellow animal who ate orchids for his survival, and the strip treated this dependency as natural and unremarkable, which was itself one of the most quietly subversive creative choices Segar made across his entire career.